Mr. Kofi Annan stayed very involved in the world's affairs. He continues to press for peace, reconciliation, and conflict resolution. As many of you well know, Mr. Annan is also chairman of Kofi Annan Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our warm welcome to Mr. Kofi Annan.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, I'm extremely happy to be able to join you here this morning. The room is so large, I can't see those at the back, but I hope you can hear me and see me. And it's also wonderful to be here where I think everyone knows who I am in the sense that I've been announced. And Kirill didn't make the mistake most people make by saying, here is a man who doesn't need any introduction. And I tell people, be careful of that phrase, because my wife and I traveled when I stepped down as Secretary General to Italy. We wanted to be incognito, took a house, and were hiding near a forest where we could go for walks in the woods. And I had decided that I didn't want to see television, read newspaper, or listen to a radio for 3 months. But after 6 weeks of this, I was getting very bored. And so I said to myself, let's go to the shop to see if we can get a newspaper. We had barely entered the shop when I saw a group of men at the corner staring at us. And one of them broke away and made for us, and I turned to my wife and said, we have 6 weeks to go, and we've blown our cover. How are we going to manage the village? By then, the fellow was on top of me, and he put his hand out and said, Morgan Freeman. May I have an autograph? So I said, sure. And I signed K. Freeman, and we continued our holidays incognito. But I'm extremely happy to be here with you this morning to share with you some of my experiences as Secretary General of the United Nations. As an organization, we were determined to make the world better. Although one of my predecessors has said, the purpose of the United Nations is not to take man to heaven, but prevent him from going to hell. We had many challenges, but all along the idea was to make the world better and to bring people together. And given the kind of work I did, as I travel around the world, people ask me, is the world better today than it was when you were Secretary General? Do we understand each other better? Are we working better together? And that is a tough question to say. I think some of you have seen the book I released recently called Interventions. And unfortunately, often when you use the word intervention, people think in terms of military force. The armies coming in and invading, which is one aspect of it, but intervention covers a whole range of activities. When I became Secretary General, one of the first things I had to analyze for myself, even though I had been with the organization for a long time, was to ask the question, what should the United Nations be doing? What can the United Nations do and do alone? What should the UN do with others? What should we leave others to do? And what should we support others to do? It became very obvious that alone we couldn't do much. We needed to network, work with others, open up the organization, and in working with us, expand our capacity that way. So I opened the door to the private sector, to civil society, to foundations and universities. And some of the ambassadors who saw the UN as a club of nation states, a club of ambassadors, were not particularly happy. And I recall several of them asking me, Mr. Secretary General, who authorized you to open our doors to civil society, business, and others. This was just before we established the Global Compact. And I told them, look at your own charter. The charter starts with we, the peoples of the United Nations. The peoples are not in this glass building in New York. They are out there with their problems, and we need to open up and reach out to them and accept the fact that the ideals and principles that the UN stands for, that we are here to defend, belongs to the people. So in the process, I got the UN to work very effectively with the private sector, civil society, and everyone. Apart from working on our political and civil war situations. When we started, the UN was more or less seen as an organization that focused only on political and military conflicts. But there were other aspects if we were going to make the world a harmonious and a happy place that had to be dealt with. We had to tackle the issue of poverty to ensure that we did whatever we can to uproot extreme poverty. With that in mind, I worked with the member states to come up with what we call the Millennium Development Goals. That at the turn of the millennium, we came up with 8 fundamental goals to help the poor live a better life. It included issues like clean drinking water, primary education for every child, particularly girls, maternity health care, and those kinds of basic issues, with a target date of 2015 where we felt every country should attain these goals. Since then, millions have been lifted out of poverty, mainly in India, China, and Brazil, and in other smaller countries. Not all of them. Not all the countries will achieve all the 8 goals, but they have achieved many. Some have better education, better health, better drinking water, and so it goes on. Another area of intervention we had to help people improve their lives was the question of HIV/AIDS. When I became Secretary General, the epidemic was at its peak. And you travel around the world and you go to a country and you visit a hospital. You see a man or a woman in bed. They knew they were dying, you saw them dying, but they also knew that there was medication somewhere else in the world that could save their lives and that their condition need not be a life sentence. But they couldn't get it simply because they were poor. And I felt we really had to do something about this, and therefore decided we should launch a global fund to fight HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. When we launched the fund, many people thought we were dreaming and we would not get the money. Since then, $22 billion have been raised to help those living with the disease. And interestingly enough, the first check I got for the fund came from President George Bush in the Rose Garden in Washington. And I know some of the civil society elements were disappointed. And I asked them, why are you disappointed? He said, oh, we think the president forgot several zeros. It should have been 2 billion, not 200 million. But President Bush, in the end, came up with PEPFAR, his own program to fight HIV/AIDS. And he put in $5 billion a year. So he really went way beyond the initial steps. But what was also important is, again, talking about unity and working together. I did not feel we should leave the matter only to governments. We reached out to work with civil society. And one of the most incredible things I did was to invite chairmen of the 7 biggest pharmaceutical companies producing medication for HIV/AIDS. We met in Amsterdam, and I had a simple agenda: to work with them to see how we can get the medication to the poor. At that time, it was $15,000 a year per person. There was no way the developing world and the poor could afford this. So we started, and I said, you know, you have to find a way of assisting the poor. Otherwise, you're going to find it extremely difficult to protect your intellectual property. If you have medication that can save lives but cannot save the poor, you undermine your whole program. So I asked them to find a way of reducing the cost of the medication so that we can give it to the poor. The first chairman who spoke said, my lawyer is not here. I don't know why I came to this meeting. I said, you don't need the lawyer. We came to discuss how we can help. He said, I could be accused of price fixing. And I responded that price fixing is colluding with others to maximize your profits. Here I'm asking you to lose money and be healthy, you know. And we went back and forth. We had a second meeting, but guess what? They did it. The medication came down a few years ago to $150. And the Verapin, medication that prevents mother-to-child transmission, the pharmaceutical companies were giving it away for free in some parts of Africa and Asia. So they saw a sense of solidarity. And of course, that is one example of how we can work together. But when I look around the world today, as I travel, whether to Middle East or North Africa, or to my own continent further south, you see the changes that are taking place. You see how small the world has become through efforts like companies like yours. With social networking, we are all wired, and people know what is going on around the world. When the Arab Spring started, and people said, this is a network or social media revolution, and that the young ones are linking up, meeting in Tahrir Square, demanding to have a say in how they are governed and by whom, and that this is a sign of the future. It was exhilarating, it was exciting, but I told everyone, don't focus, it started in Tunisia. Don't focus on Tunisia, think of the region, and then far beyond. I also remember the Chinese Revolution, the Tiananmen Square episode, and I will come back to Middle East. In 1989, when Tiananmen Square exploded, I was working in New York. The government closed down communication, radio, nothing was coming out. But in those days, the technology was fax. It was a fax revolution. The students were faxing each other. I could get useful information to know what was happening in Tiananmen Square, because 2 staff members working for us had apartments overlooking the square, so they could fax in information. With the Arab Spring, by then we've moved to the internet. If there's another resolution in 10 years' time, I don't know what tools people will be using. But they did use the social media to organize themselves to meet, to come together. And I think that was credible. But when you organize yourself that way, it also raises the question of the leadership. Most revolutions often have a leader or a group of leaders pushing it along. With the internet revolution, sometimes people come together, they gather, and a leader has to emerge. When a leader does not emerge, you can be faced with very chaotic situation. Today, what we are seeing in North Africa is not something that I think can be resolved in a year or 2. It is a revolution, and maybe we should think in terms of a 10-year time frame. think of how long the French Revolution took. And so we should really look at it. The other issue which I have been pondering is the street versus the parliament. For a very long time, we often refer to the Arab street, that leaders were afraid of the Arab street in the sense that people could take to the streets after Friday prayers and shake things up. 3 million people took to the streets in Egypt and changed the government in a country with 45 million voters. I think everybody seemed happy because they were removing leaders who were autocratic and had been there for a long time. Would it be legitimate if a billionaire in some Asian or African country got several million people into the streets and changed a legitimately elected government? These are questions we need to think about. Is it legitimate for people to take to the streets to have a debate instead of parliament? Is the street an alternative to the parliament? Is the street an alternative to democratic rotation of leadership through elections? But the elections have to have integrity. It has to be on a fair basis. And it must not be corrupted with money. These are questions that we also need to ponder. I think the Egyptians, the Tunisians, and to some extent the Libyans will in time find their way, but it is going to take time. I also know that sometimes we are overly concerned about Islam and Islamists. I think instead of being overly concerned, we need to think through how can we work together, help each other out, learn from each other. Throughout history, cultures and civilizations and religions have existed side by side and learned from each other. How can we help steer things? How can we share information? And basically, when you analyze religion, all the major religions provide education in social morality. It's wrong to kill, it's wrong to lie. Treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated. How come we can't find ways of working? So we should resist this temptation to be afraid of the other or keep the other at bay and find a way of working together and finding common purpose. I often tell my friends, when you say be careful of the Islamists when you're talking of an Islamic state, it's a bit like me going to Rome and telling the Italians, beware of the Catholics. It doesn't work that way. But let me, as I started by saying, when it happened in Tunisia, I said, let's not focus on Tunisia, but look at the possible impact within the region and the impact in the region it has had. Not only has the Libyan crisis spilled into Mali, the serious situation in Mali with the French military engaged and the UN preparing to send peacekeepers there. Libya, or Gaddafi, had quite a few African soldiers fighting for him. Soldiers from the Tuareg group in Mali. And they went back to Mali with all the heavy guns and took northern Mali and began to roll down until the French intervened. So in a way, Mali became collateral damage of the operations in Libya. Libya has also had an impact on Syria, and I will explain. And as some of you know, I took on the task of a mediator for Syria for 6 months. When I took on the job, I knew it was going to be a very difficult task. But I told the Security Council, we can't make a contribution and help contain the situation if the Security Council stay united, work together, and put sustained pressure on the countries in the region and on the parties within Syria. But that was not to be. Initially, they passed 2 resolutions. They all said, we agree with you, Mr. Annan, you have your full support. And then I came up with a 6-point plan for peace in Syria, which included the withdrawal of governmental troops and heavy weapons from cities, release of the prisoners, unfettered access for humanitarian goods, and so forth. And they all said, we support the 6-point plan. The only game in town is a 6-point plan. But it was all verbal. They did not really put pressure on the parties to support it. On the 12th of April last year, I pushed for a ceasefire and said all guns must stop. And on the 12th of April, the guns went silent on both sides, which demonstrated that they could stop it if they wanted and that someone was in charge. But it lasted 72 hours. When they realized there was no pressure, the government started shooting again, and the opposition joined in. And it has continued and gotten worse. Again, in June last year, 30th of June, I organized a meeting in Geneva that brought together the foreign ministers of the permanent members of the Security Council. Mrs. Clinton, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Minister Ye of China, Laurent Fabius of France, and Hague of UK. And we brought along with them the foreign ministers of Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, and Turkey, along with the 2 Secretaries General of the United Nations and the Arab League. And we agreed in Geneva that the only solution to the Syrian crisis is political settlement. A political settlement that would entail an establishment of a transitional government with full executive authority. An interim government that would ensure that governmental institutions worked, security forces were given the right leadership, and the minorities and all groups in Syria had their interests protected. It's not just Shia and Sunni. You have the Christians, you have the Druze, you have the Turkmen, you have Kurds, Ismailia, and these are the communities that form the mosaic of Syria. A civilization that has had people living in cities like Aleppo in Syria for over 2 million years. And these cities are being destroyed today, little by little. When I became Special Envoy for Syria in February last year,